Hi, Algebra. It is page 4, notes this time around, and we are talking about the topic evaluating expressions. So first of all, the word expressions is simply a mathematical statement without an equal sign. So think about things like 2x and 5x plus 7. Those are expressions. They do not have equal signs in them. And so what we're going to be doing today is evaluating those at given values. So for example, this is an important skill to have in algebra because you're going to need to be able to replace and work with variables. So for example, what if we had something that looked like this? A squared b squared minus b times a. And the question will ask, well, what is the value of this if a equals 7 and b equals -1? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace everywhere I see an a with the value of 7, and I'm going to replace everywhere I see the value of b with a -1. And so the very first step that I'm going to do here is just make those replacements. And so again, if we see that we have a squared, well, a is 7, so that's actually going to be 7 squared. Now, when I plug in numbers or I replace variables with numbers, I like to put them in parentheses. It's not really necessary. You could have just wrote 7 squared. But it does become necessary when you have situations like what we're going to see next. So b is equal to -1. So I'm going to take a -1. I'm going to drop it right in where I see that b, replacing the value of b with -1. And we've got -1 squared. Now, it's important that when you're squaring negative numbers, you leave them in parentheses. And I'm going to show you just in a minute what I mean in the calculator. And then we've got minus, of course, that comes next in our expression. And then we've got b times a. So we're going to, again, replace b with a -1 and a with 7. And okay, I like putting them in parentheses because if you didn't, this might look like if you just plugged in a -1 and then an a right next to it, a 7, it might look like -17, but we're actually multiplying those numbers. It's not -17, it's -1 times 7. And so just be careful when you're plugging that in. So put them in parentheses, it makes it easier. Now we're going to start doing the math. We're going to start evaluating. Now, of course, we're going to use order of operations because we've got powers here and we've got multiplication, we've got subtraction. So don't forget about PEMDAS, or maybe GEMDAS, you've learned it. It doesn't matter whether you use a G or a P to begin with. It's grouping or parentheses, right? So the first thing we have to look for is, do we see any grouping symbols? Well, of course we do, but is there anything to work out here inside the parentheses? No, that's just 7. Same thing here. It's just a -1, just a -1, just a 7. There's nothing to work out inside the grouping symbols. Next will be exponents, though, and we do have a couple of exponents. So 7 squared, that should be one you have memorized, but if not, I'm going to open up Desmos on my phone here. You can open it up on your computer screen, and I'm going to type in 7 squared, and of course that's 49. So we've got the number 49, evaluating this. And then we're going to multiply that by -1 squared minus -1 times 7. All right, now we still have an exponent to do, and so we're going to work with this next. Now, here's why it's important that that's in parentheses. So I'm going to exit that out. Let's type in. Notice think about it first. What is -1 squared? That's the same thing as -1 times -1, and what's a negative times a negative? That's a positive. And so we know that this answer is going to be +1. Now watch what happens if I type it in Desmos without the parentheses. So I'm going to type in -1. Remember, negative is the same thing as subtraction in Desmos. And then I'm going to square it. Look at what the answer it says it is. It says that the answer is -1. Now this is because Desmos knows order of operations. And what Desmos thinks you're doing right here, Desmos thinks you are squaring 1, because of course exponents come first, and then you are making it negative. So what Desmos is doing is 1 squared, which is 1, and then make it negative. And that, of course, is not what we're trying to do. So we have to be able to tell Desmos exactly what we want it to do, which is, in parentheses, -1, and then I'm going to click on the outside of the parentheses and square that. So we want to make sure we put that in any negative number in parentheses before we raise it to any kind of a power to get the correct answer in the calculator. You have to let the calculator know what you're doing. So the answer, of course, is 1. And so we have 49 times 1 minus -1 times 7. All right, now we have finished with exponents. Now we're ready to multiply and divide. Well, we have two things that we can multiply here. We've got 49 times 1, which is 49, minus, and then we've got -1 times 7, which is -7. Now we're ready to add and subtract. Well, minus a negative we know is the same thing as plus a positive. And so 49 plus 7, and you could actually type that in either way. If you wanted to type in 49 minus -7, it's going to give you 56, or if you know minus a negative is a positive, you can just type in 49 plus 7, which also gives you 56. So our final answer here is 56. All right, and that is what we're doing when we're evaluating expressions. So I'm going to give you a couple of small ones, and let's just see what you can do. So I'm going to ask you maybe to pause the video and work out these really quick and simple ones just to practice what we just did. So we're going to have 4 little tiny examples here. 3, 4, example 3, and example 4. All right, so first thing I want you to do is do A over B. Second thing I want you to do is to do the absolute value of A minus B. Third example I want you to do is A squared. And the last thing I want you to do is the cube root of -B. All right, and I want you to evaluate these when, these little instructions, when A equals -3 and B, it's an N, y'all, B equals 8. All right, so go ahead and pause the video, see if you can try these on your own, and then unpause the video to get the answers. All right, I hope you paused the video. So let's look at example number 1. So example number 1, we want to plug in -3 and 8 everywhere we see A and B. So we're going to plug in -3 where we see the A, and we want to plug in 8 where we see the B. Now, you can change that to a decimal if you want to, but that is actually as far as you can do that. -3 will not divide evenly by 8, and we also can't simplify that. So if you did happen to go ahead and divide those numbers, you would have gotten -3 divided by 8, which is -0.375. So either you left it as this fraction, or you got -0.375. All right, example number 2 was the absolute value of -3, plug that in for A, minus B, which is 8. So if we do, and grouping symbols, remember, act like or absolute value symbols act like grouping symbols. And so we're going to do the inside first. So -3 minus 8. That gives us -11, but we're still inside the absolute value bars. So we don't make these things positive first and then subtract. We go ahead and work out the math inside the absolute value bars, and then we do the absolute value here. So the absolute value of -11 is 11. And so your answer for example number 2 should have been 11. For example number 3, A is being squared, and I hope you remembered what we said just a second ago about when you plug in a negative number to square. -3 squared has to be in parentheses. If you got a negative answer, you did not put it in parentheses. So -3 in parentheses, and then we want to square that. That gives us 9. And then last but not least, we have the cube root of -B. Well, of course, B is 8, so the cube root of -8. And remember where to find the cube root on your calculator in Desmos. You go to the keyboard, you go to Functions, you go to the Miscellaneous menu, and remember the cube root or the root symbol is right here, but we have to type in our 3 up above the root symbol, the radical symbol. and then we've got negative 8. And remember, this is asking us what number times itself times itself times itself 3 times will give us negative 8. Well, it's negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. And so the answer here is negative 2. How did you do? So again, this is evaluating expressions. I want to do one more example that's a little more complicated. So let's do one last example down here at the bottom, and then you're going to practice this. So let's do 1/4 mn plus the absolute value of p squared parenthesis plus the cube root of n. Now, if you can work this example out, then you are probably going to be able to answer any question that gets thrown at you. So we want to evaluate this when we have the following. So we have m is going to be equal to 64. We're going to have n equal to 343. And we're going to have p equal to negative 7. All right, and so the first thing, remember, is always just to plug in your numbers. Do that first. So we're going to go through, we're going to replace all of our variables. So m is going to be 64. Remember I said I like to, and that, remember, that's multiplication right here, right? We've got a 1/4 right next to an m. That means 1/4 times m. So the first thing we're going to do is, I like to put the little multiplication there to remind me what I'm doing, but then I'm going to put 64 in parentheses because I'm replacing it. All right, then we have the actual set of parentheses that were already included in the problem. Then n, I'm going to put it in parentheses, 343. I'm replacing it where n goes, plus the absolute value of, I'm going to put negative 7 in parentheses, because we're squaring it. We're also taking the absolute value of it. And then end parenthesis, so that's this big parenthesis, plus the cube root of 343. Now, I'm not going to put it in parentheses because it's already inside that cube root. All right, so now we're following order of operations. We've got grouping symbols, exponents, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. So first thing's grouping. Now, we do have a lot of parentheses. There's nothing to work out in here. There's nothing to work out in here, but we do have this big set of parentheses here in the middle. So I'm going to figure out what all of this is first. So I'm just going to copy down my 1/4 times 64, and now I'm going to work inside of here. Well, inside of this set of parentheses, there's multiple things to do. We've got 343 plus, but then we've got all of this. So I'm not going to worry about my 343 just yet. I'm just going to copy it down. I'm not even going to put it in parentheses because it's kind of like doubling the parentheses here. 343 plus, I'm going to worry about this part first because there's nothing to work out inside the parentheses until I know what this is equal to. So first, negative 7 squared. That should be something that you can probably think of in your head, but we're going to go ahead and look at what it would be if I put negative 7 inside parentheses and then I square it. Well, that's the same thing as positive 7 squared, which was 49. Now, remember, that's still inside absolute value bars because all I did just there was evaluate this negative 7 squared. So it's still 49 inside parentheses, or inside absolute value bars. Then I'm going to close my parenthesis. That comes from right here. And then plus, I'm still got the cube root of 343. All right, the next thing left to do is we still inside the parentheses here. We have not finished our initial grouping symbol. So I'm going to copy down 1/4 times 64, 343 inside parentheses, plus what is the absolute value of 49? Well, that's just regular 49 in parentheses plus the cube root of 343. Now, I'm still not finished with this set of parentheses because there's 2 things to add. So I'm going to get my calculator and I'm going to do 343 plus 49. And I get 392. So I'm going to rewrite everything again, times 64 times 392 plus the cube root of 343. All right, finally we're making some progress. So we're finished with grouping symbols. Now comes exponents. Now, we do not have any exponents. We already took care of that back here, right? However, the exponent step will also include roots. Remember, square roots are connected to squaring numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and work on this piece before I do all this multiplication. So 1/4 times 64 times 392 plus, I'm going to type this in, the cube root. We've already reminded ourselves cube root is under functions, miscellaneous, the n root. I'm going to type in 3 above the root, and I've got 343. So this is saying what number times itself times itself times itself will give me 343. That ends up being 7. So the answer to this is 7. Finished with my exponent step, ready to multiply and divide. Well, we've got 1/4 times 64 is our first multiplication fact. Now, you can type in fractions in Desmos, remember? It's just division. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type in 1 divided by 4, which is the fraction here. Now, notice your cursor is down here with the 4, so I'm actually going to click over next to it so I can type in multiplication, and I'm going to type in 64. So that answer is 16. We've still got to multiply it by 392 plus 7. So I'm going to multiply, this is my last multiplication fact. I'm going to multiply 16 times 392. You get 6,272 plus 7. Now, I've already got that answer in there, so if I just go down to the next line, nope. Yeah, I can just go down to the next line, look at my answer here, 6,272 plus 7, and my final answer is 6,279. And that is evaluating expressions. Make sure you have all of those notes written down and you're ready to practice.